Hi, this is Amy from Good Food Unearthed, and you are watching part three of my presentation series on human rights. And this is a brief educational overview that specifically applies to Canada, but there, of course, is information that you may be able to use wherever you are. And again, this is a starting point, so take it as it is and do your own research. This is just a basic foundational overview. So let's get started on our international um, agreements, international treaties, covenants that Canada is signatory to. So here we go. So let's look at these. And we're going to start off with this quote from Rocco Galati that was taken in 2019 during an interview with Del Bigtree of The High Wire. And Rocco Galati cited his Victorious Baker case 1999. And in this, he says Canada is the only Western country where any international treaty rights must be incorporated into Canadian domestic law. Court said any treaty right is a minimal constitutional protection and standard. In other words, the standards in the Nuremberg Code are not mere guidelines in Canada, they are actionable constitutional guarantees. So that's really saying something. And we're going to look at the Nuremberg Code in relation to informed consent when we dig into Canadian medical law and informed consent issues there. So, first, we're going to look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and specifically the the articles that are violated by the COVID measures. We're not going to look at every single one of them, but I will outline some of the most pertinent ones. So we'll start with Article 1. And the first list there of all the articles, these are all the articles that I would say have been violated. Now you can check them out yourself and see what you think. But let's start with Article 1. And again, that is not, this is what we covered in part 1 on what are human rights. And this is before the rights are even stated. This is a statement of reality. All human beings are born free. They are born equal in dignity. They are born equal in rights. They are endowed with, they are born with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. So why are the COVID-19 measures in violation of this? Because for multiple reasons, but one, they're in violation of your human rights and they are giving certain rights to certain people and taking them away from others, such as the freedom of movement to be able to go where you want to go, to leave your country, to come back to your country, the um, arbitrary interference in your family life, in your privacy, the security of the person, and so on. So there are rights that are being violated for some and not for others. We're having a segregated society being created, and that in itself violates the human dignity of the individual, those whose rights are not recognized. And we are born free, but we're experiencing repressive activities that are attempting to take away our free will choice, to minimize that, to say that, well, we can decide that this view supersedes this one, and you have to go along with this one. Now, uh, there is also endowed with reason and conscience, and that is true. But how many people respect that? And is it being respected today? Or are we too busy dividing each other and fighting amongst each other? So, Article 2, everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. That includes your health status. So, religion, again, as we went over in part 2, religare means to bound, and it is your actions, your speech, and your actions, the expression of your beliefs, the practice of your worldviews, of how you see reality functioning. That is religion. And your political or other opinion, we're seeing censorship of that heavy censorship, stigmatization, ostracizing, shaming, encouraging incitement of discrimination. So, even before we get to any of the rights that are outlined, we have these first two articles that are being violated, these two statements of reality. One is a statement of the nature of reality, and the second is basically saying that if you have a free, just, and peaceful society, then everybody is entitled to the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, which is kind of reiterating what Article 1 says, because we are born equal in rights, right? So rights are entitlements to do or not to do something, to be or not to be somewhere. Article 3 is the first stated right. And this is similar to the Declaration of Independence, where it is stated that we hold these truths to be self-evident. This is coming from natural law, that all men are created equal, and that all have the right to pursue life, or to have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, in the UN, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. So, life, we're going to look into that a bit, but it doesn't mean just living and breathing. Think about what your definition of life is. And liberty is to not be bound, to not be bound by the obligations or will of another. You are not subject to them. You always have free will. It's inherent, it's inalienable. You may have perceived certain options in your viewpoint. Know that they are not always your only options, but you have those perceptions, and even in that state, you always make the choice. It is always down to your individual choice. Security of the person. This is defined as your bodily and psychological autonomy, your privacy of that, and of your health status. That's included in that because it's your physical body, it's your mental body, it's your psychological health. And you have the right to protect your physical and psychological integrity. And here in Canada, there was actually court precedents for this, for the psychological integrity as well, that if the state acts intentionally to violate your psychological integrity through intentional fear mongering, to get you to comply with certain public health measures, they are in fact infringing upon your right of security of person. So another thing to consider here is the right to life. And we have had in the long-term care and nursing homes blanket DNR orders, do not resuscitate orders, given without the patient's informed consent and their family's informed consent or their legal guardian's informed consent. We have had the denial of medical treatment during COVID-19, and for many people, that resulted in loss of life. We have had the denial of being able to work for oneself, to support oneself. There's been a high rate of suicides. And that's your right to live, to support yourself and your family, to have that subsistence, which will be stated in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that your means of subsistence cannot be taken from you. So we're having this breach of our bodily autonomy, our psychological autonomy, and we're going to dig more into that when we look at the Convention Against Torture and Cruel, Degrading, and Inhumane Treatment. We're going to look at the psychological impact of the COVID-19 measures. But your life, liberty, and security of person, all of this Article 3 is being violated. So those are the first most important articles, and everything else connects to them. Everything else is tied to them. And as we talked about in part 1, all of the rights that are mentioned are indivisible and they are integrated. They are part and parcel of each other. So the enjoyment of one is the enjoyment of others. And if you repress one, you are going to be in violation of the others. So let's look now at Article 4. No one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. What does it mean to be a slave? What does it mean to be a servant? It means that you as an individual have subjugated yourself to the obligation or will of another. Now, that was still your free will choice, if that was your option, but you are a slave, a servant to another. And if that situation is forced upon you, that is even worse. So no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. No one shall be subjugated by the obligation or will of another, period. This shall be prohibited in all its forms. All of its forms. Article 5 states that no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. And again, we're going to dive into that when we look at the convention on this specific topic. But there are gross violations of this. Now, with these COVID measures and the fear-mongering, coercing people to do certain things, to comply, that is coercing you to be subjugated, to be a slave, to be a servant, to the will of another. That's Article 4. Now, Article 12 states that no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, with his family, with his home, or his correspondence, nor to attacks upon his honor and reputation. Everyone has the right to the protection of law against such interference or attacks. The COVID measures are arbitrary. Now, the testing, the contact tracing, the tracking and trace, the COVID test, the masking the infringements upon your bodily autonomy, your psychological autonomy, that is your privacy, and then upon your family with how your children are being treated. The children are the parents' responsibility, not the responsibility of the state. Unless there's no other option, the parents are responsible for the children. Your home or your correspondence. So we have people who had holiday gatherings in their home, and then police were called, police raids, to break up the gathering because there were one too many people. That is your private residence and your business and not the business of the state. But again, since we are living under medical martial law, we've suspended constitutional rights and human rights and patient rights and consent rights and so on. And your correspondence will include what you post on social media. So the arbitrary interference that comes with the censorship or any penalizing from your post, from your freedom of expression, of speech, your freedom of expressing your thoughts, opinions, and beliefs, is arbitrary interference into your correspondence. Now, attacks upon honor and reputation are defamation, libel, and slander, which are criminal in the Canadian Criminal Code. And for any nurses or any healthcare professionals who have spoken out and they've been defamed, libeled, and slandered against, they can take that to criminal court. So, Article 30, the last one of this, which I think is pretty important, states that nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying for any state, group, or person any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of the rights and freedoms set forth herein. So now let's look at the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR. And we have the listed articles that the COVID-19 measures violate. Now, Article 1.2, as I mentioned a bit earlier, states that in no case may a people be deprived of its own means of subsistence. And you can have business closures included in here. But that also means if there's any violation, any infringement upon the accessibility of clean air, clean food, clean water, adequate shelter, clothing, the means for you as a human being to survive. We also know that it is a human need to have social interaction, and that is not screen time. We know that that is not an adequate substitute. It is physical, in person, social interaction that includes human touch. And we know that this is a human need that many people now are being deprived of. And there are grave consequences for that. The other important article in here is Article 4 that states in time of public emergency, which threatens the life of the nation and the existence of which is officially proclaimed, the states parties to the present covenant may take measures derogating from their obligations under the present covenant to the extent strictly required by the exigencies of the situation, provided that such measures are not inconsistent with their other obligations under international law and do not involve discrimination solely on the ground of race, color, sex, language, religion, or social origin. And on top of that, there can be no derogation from Articles 6, 7, 8, paragraphs 1 and 2, 11, 15, 16, and 18. maybe under this provision. So let's look at that first section in Article 4. This public emergency says that the derogations of away from articles such as, the infringements on charter rights and freedoms, as we talked about in part 2, it has to be to the extent strictly required. This is a targeted approach, not arbitrary, not vague, by the exigencies of the situation. And this needs to be demonstrably justified, provided that such measures are not inconsistent with their other obligations under international law and do not involve discrimination solely on the ground of race, color, sex, language, religion, or social origin. And religion, as we talked about, is your practice of your worldviews, your beliefs. And a belief is accepting that something is true based on your experience, based on your perceptions, based on your input of data. That will bind your speech and actions, your expression. Now let's look at, even in the event of a public emergency, the articles that cannot be derogated from. So Article 6.1, every human being has the inherent right to life. This shall be protected by law. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his life. Well, let's just look at the open letter from the World Doctors Alliance, with the collateral damage of the cure being worse than the damage associated with what is called COVID-19. Placing the public under virtual house arrest has caused untold damage to both physical and mental health. Ventilating patients instead of oxygenating patients proved to be a deadly policy and an unwarranted failure. Ventilation resulted in many unnecessary deaths. Sending infected people from hospitals to care homes placed the elderly and frail under unnecessary risk and resulted in many unnecessary deaths. Blanket do not resuscitate DNR orders were imposed on thousands of people without their consent nor the consent of their families. This is both unlawful and immoral and led to unnecessary deaths in care homes. Hospitals became essentially COVID-only centers. Vast numbers of patients were willfully neglected, resulting in many thousands of unnecessary deaths. The government's own report estimates that some 200,000 people will die as a direct result of lockdown, not the virus. Hospitals being closed, suicide, and poverty will result in more deaths than the virus. The cure is worse than the disease. And you can go look this up at worlddoctorsalliance.com. And this is their open letter with, I believe, um, specific response with the government to the UK government there with the 200,000 people. But the other measures as well are applicable here in Canada. Article 7, no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. And the second part is so important. In particular, no one shall be subjected without his free consent to medical or scientific experimentation. And we need to define informed consent. Free, informed consent is so essential. It doesn't have the word informed here, but we're going to look at that in our next part on medical law and informed consent. And medical or scientific experimentation, as I mentioned earlier, this is what is going on with these medical mandates, with the lockdowns, the closures of businesses, with the mask mandates, with the um, isolations and quarantines. So these are things that are experimental, and you are not being provided the chance to have fully informed consent. And that is a violation of your human rights. So let's look at what some definitions are here as well. Cruel, if you look up cruelty in criminal law, this refers to severe violations of the respect, recognition, and care that the unconditional and inherent dignity of each and every individual commands. Cruelty occurs when a grave violation of human dignity that in normal circumstances would amount to cruelty is caused by individuals or by the operation of impersonal institutions, structures, or social processes, even if the victim is unaware of his predicament. We have people who have died in hospital and they were not allowed to have a family member there to say goodbye to them, or died in a care home and they were not allowed to be with their loved ones before that time. We have had a lot of cruel treatment that, under normal circumstances, we would say was cruel. But because of our fear and because of our lack of investigation into the facts, we allow cruelty to happen to others. We allow this to continue, but it is cruel, and that is a violation of your human rights. Torture is any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for such purposes as intimidating or coercing him or a third person, or for any reason based on discrimination of any kind, when such pain or suffering is inflicted by, or at the instigation of, or with the consent or acquiescence of a public official or other person acting in an official capacity. And crimes against humanity from the Rome Statute, which we will also go into, include, but are not limited to, other severe deprivation of physical liberty in violation of fundamental rules of international law, torture, persecution against an identifiable group or collectivity on political, racial, national, ethnic, cultural, religious, gender, etc., or other grounds that are universally recognized as impermissible under international law in connection with any act referred to in this paragraph or any crime within the jurisdiction of the court, and other inhumane acts of a similar character intentionally causing great suffering or serious injury to the body or to mental or physical health. So, Article 8 states that no one shall be held in slavery. Slavery and the slave trade in all their forms shall be prohibited, and no one shall be held in servitude. Now, we went over this before, but I'll define it again. A slave is one who is owned as the property of someone else, especially in involuntary servitude. If you say you have no bodily autonomy, your body is not your property and it belongs to an unelected expert who gets to decide for you what medical treatment you get. You have no choice in the matter. Your body is no longer yours. You do not have bodily autonomy. A slave is someone who's subservient to or controlled by another. It is one who is subject to or controlled by a specified influence. The fear that is being used right now is being used as a tool to enforce compliance. And all the little steps, the arbitrary steps, the social distancing, the 6 feet apart, the plastic barriers, the constant washing of hands, the mask wearing, and the rules with the mask wearing, You have to wear it when you step into a restaurant. When you sit down, you can take off your mask. But if you step up to go to the bathroom, you have to put your mask on. And if you understand science and logic, that has no, no logical sense whatsoever, but that's intentional because those arbitrary rules are designed to have compliance, to acquiesce. And if you understand the rules of hypnosis, what you learn about with hypnosis is that you get people to acquiesce with you, to say yes 3 times, and then they've given over their control to you. You are now the director of their fate. Liberty is not to be controlled by the obligation or will of another. And again, all of us, are born free. We all have free will. It's your choice if you want to give away your choices to someone else. So, Article 18 states that everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And we covered this a bit with the Charter rights and freedoms. This right shall include freedom to have or to adopt a religion or belief of your choice, and freedom either individually or in community with others and in public or private to manifest your religion or belief in worship, observance, practice, and teaching. No one shall be subject to coercion, which would impair your freedom to have or adopt a religion or belief of your choice. Now, again, a belief is an acceptance that something is true, and this is formed through your reason and conscience. And your religion is the binding of your expression, your uh, your speech, and your actions that are bound by your belief. So it's the practice of your belief, the practice of your worldview that comes to you through your unique perception and your reasoning and your conscience. They're intimately tied together. As scientism is the promotion of science as the best or only objective means by which society should determine normative and epistemological values. But it's an ideology, it's a dogma that uses only specific paradigms and chooses to ignore any contradictory evidence, any contradictory narratives, and says that only this is important and you have to follow this. And the experts are who you should listen to. You cannot evaluate this information, only the experts can. So people are being forced, they're being coerced to adopt this scientism. And that is a violation of your rights. All right, so let's look at the next one, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And we have the articles there 3, 6, 7, 10, 11, 12, 13. Article 6 states that the states parties to the present covenant recognize the right to work, which includes the right of everyone to the opportunity to gain his living by work, which he freely chooses or accepts, and will take appropriate steps to safeguard this right. Article 7 states that the states parties to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to the enjoyment of just and favorable conditions of work, which ensure, in particular, a decent living for themselves and their families in accordance with the provisions of the present covenant and safe and health working conditions. So let's look at those two. We have small businesses that are being told to close down, that they have to close down through orders coming from their chief medical officers, an unelected expert. And that's a violation of your right to work, your right to provide for yourself and your family. and that is your right to the opportunity to gain your living by work that you freely choose and accept. And the state should safeguard this right, not violate it, but safeguard it. And on top of that, you should be able to provide a decent living for yourself and your family in accordance with the provisions in this charter. So that should be safeguarded. And the safe and health working conditions. Well, let's talk about the medical mandates. And let's talk about the use of antibacterial soaps, of the masks, of the plexiglass barriers, of the vaccine. We'll start with the antibacterial hand soaps. Health Canada has no antibacterial hand soaps that are listed as safe. And the FDA in 2019 said that soap and water is fine and antibacterial soaps are actually harmful because they destroy the beneficial microorganisms that exist on your skin, which are actually creating a protective barrier. And when you destroy that, you also destroy the pH balance on your skin, which can lead to cracks, that can lead to open sores and wounds, which can lead to infection. Now, how many people are getting informed consent about that? Then you have the mask and your local occupational health and safety. When you look up the act, you can look up respiration equipment, and that includes masking. So these masks, all of the different types, actually deplete your oxygen intake very quickly and increase your CO2 levels to dangerous quantities within a matter of minutes. And I'm not making this up, so please go ahead and look it up yourself. But this is not safe working conditions. Now, if your work is made a policy that you have to wear a mask, you should ask your workplace, demand from your workplace to provide you with the evidence, and also to notify them, give them a notice of liability, and make sure, say, do you have insurance to cover me? You're giving me medical advice. So there are some options to take here. And the plexiglass barriers, again, with the social isolation, and you're not interacting with people, you're not building up exchange of most people don't realize that your microbiome extends outward from you, and you're constantly exchanging microorganisms with your environment just from existing. That's just the way it is, and you can't stop it. It's never going to stop. So by trying to separate yourself, you're limiting your interaction with your environment, and you can become less adaptable, which, you could translate to not as well immune. You could be less adaptable. So that as well. And then the vaccination. A mandatory vaccination is a huge violation of your rights. And it's a violation of safe and health working conditions, because to force vaccination as a condition of employment when you don't have, from your workplace, you haven't provided fully informed consent. You haven't taken into account that individuals may not be able to take certain medications or certain medical advice because it actually is contraindicative for them. And that is a problem. All right, Article 10 states that the states party to the present covenant recognize that 1, the widest possible protection and assistance should be accorded to the family, which is the natural and fundamental group unit of society, particularly for its establishment, and while it is responsible for the care and education of dependent children. So we're looking here now at specifically with the family group and the parental rights and the care of children in society. And we are not giving the best protection and assistance to children, to mothers, to families as a whole. Special protection, part two, should be accorded to mothers during a reasonable period before and after childbirth. And we have these mandatory COVID tests for pregnant mothers and pregnant mothers wearing masks and their children, in some cases, being having face shields put on them. And this is something that is not protection. This is something that you as an individual need to take personal accountability for and research and find out what is there and stand up for your rights. Part 3 says that special measures of protection and assistance should be taken on behalf of all children and young persons without any discrimination for reasons of parentage or other conditions. And say, for example, if they're working, their employment in work that is harmful to their morals or health or dangerous to life or likely to hamper their normal development should be punishable by law. Now we have this masking of children going into schools and the mandatory testing and the contact tracking and tracing, and then the vaccinations. And if they make those vaccinations conditions of attending schools, and that is not protection and assistance for children. That is violating their human rights, and that is unsafe. That is dangerous to their life and likely to hamper their normal development, and that should be punishable by law. Article 11 states that state parties to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate food, clothing, and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. The states parties will take appropriate steps to ensure the realization of this right, recognizing to this effect the essential importance of international cooperation. Here's the key: based on free consent. So everyone has the right to an adequate standard of living. And you can just go back to Article 1.2 in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that said, no people shall be deprived of its means of subsistence. And that is your clean air, clean food, clean water. So not polluted by these corporations who have no liability, and there's no recourse for people at this time to protect the environments, to keep them safe, to keep them healthy so that they can be healthy living there. Adequate food, clothing, housing. So by closing small businesses, you're depriving people of their ability to make a living for themselves and their family, which is making people dependent on handouts and making them desperate and making them depressed and making them suicidal and making them ill from stress and worry and fear. And there's so much more to this when you look at the web of control, but specifically with the COVID-19 measures, the closing of businesses that is arbitrary. This is highly detrimental, and it's a violation of your rights. Article 12 states that the right of everyone is recognized to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Now, who decides what that is? Well, if you go back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which these following covenants are based upon, you will find the security of the person security of person is your autonomy of your physical body, of your psychological health, your right, your choice, what happens for your health care, your health freedom, your right to health care freedom. All right, so let's look at the Convention Against Torture and Cruel and Degrading or Inhumane Treatment or Punishment. The COVID-19 measures violate Articles 1, 2, 6, 10, 12, 13, 14, and 16. Article 1 states that for the purposes of this convention, the term torture means any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for such purposes as intimidating or coercing him or a third person, or for any reason based on discrimination of any kind, when such pain or suffering is inflicted by or at the instigation of or with consent or acquiescence of a public official or other person acting in an official capacity. Now, it also ends with it does not include pain or suffering arising only from, inherent in, or incidental to lawful sanctions. So that right in there is a contradiction, because any laws that violate the fundamental inherent rights and freedoms should be null and void. If the lawful sanction includes torture, then they are by definition a violation, regardless of if they are designated lawful. Article 2, Part 2 states that no exceptional circumstances whatsoever, whether a state of war or a threat of war, internal political instability, or any other public emergency, may be invoked as a justification of torture. The psychological torture deployed by the mainstream media is not justified, even with the reason of enforcing compliance during a public emergency. And 3, an order from a superior officer or a public authority may not be invoked as a justification of torture. And the Canadian Criminal Code makes torture illegal. Every official or every person acting at the instigation of or with the consent or acquiescence of an official who inflicts torture on any other person is guilty of an indictable offense and liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 14 years. For the purposes of this section, official means a peace officer, a public officer, a member of the Canadian Forces, or any person who may exercise powers pursuant to a law in force in a foreign state that would in Canada be exercised by a person referred to in paragraph A, B, or C, whether the person exercises powers in Canada or outside Canada. Torture means any act or omission by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for a purpose, including obtaining from the person or from a third person information or a statement, punishing the person for an act that the person or a third person has committed or is suspected of having committed, and intimidating or coercing the person or a third person, or for any reason based on discrimination of any kind. There is no defense. It is no defense to a charge under this section that the accused was ordered by a superior or a public authority to perform the act or omission that forms the subject matter of the charge, or that the act or omission is alleged to have been justified by exceptional circumstances, including a state of war, a threat of war, internal political instability, or any other public emergency. So let's look at coercion and psychological torture to understand this a bit more. Coercion is the intimidation of a victim to compel the individual to do some act against his or her will by the use of psychological pressure, physical force, or threats. And this is huge when it implies the threat of the full force of the state coming on you. Psychological torture includes methods that are designed to exploit psychological weaknesses. Rather than break the body, these techniques could break the minds of detainees or induce their cooperation while leaving no physical marks. As bad as physical torture is, psychological torture can, in the long run, be much worse. This is stated by Dr. Frank Summers, a psychologist specializing in the effects of severe emotional disturbance. Because if someone breaks your leg or breaks your arm, that can heal. But if somebody breaks down your mind, you may never get it back. Victims of psychological torture, understood in the literature as torture that leaves no lasting physical marks, report similar levels of pain and suffering as victims of more physically aggressive torture at the time of abuse and suffer similar health effects over time. Indeed, one recent study demonstrated that psychological stressors cannot be easily distinguished from physical torture in terms of their relative psychological impact. Common chronic health effects of psychological torture include post traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression. Going one step further and explaining the severe threat that high stress levels pose to the autonomic nervous system and basic GI tract and circulatory system functioning, Dr. Rona M. Fields, a psychologist with expertise in violence and terrorism, wrote, "There is no longer any basis for arguing that the use of such techniques neither does organ damage nor endangers life itself. Psychological torture endangers life itself. That is a violation of your right to life, liberty, and security of person on all counts." And by the way, this document is from Berkeley Law, and I have the link there, and you can also find it on my website and read the document yourself. So, how does psychological torture work? I'm going to read this, and you can see if this psychological torture is happening right now with the COVID measures and the media reporting that is happening 24/7. Psychological torture breaks down the human mind through a powerful assault on the victim's basic conditions for mental survival. Psychologists refer to these conditions as homeostasis, originally a term of physiology referring to the ability of an organism to adjust internally to maintain a stable equilibrium, even in response to external changes. Under normal circumstances, an individual will respond to disruptions in homeostasis through periods of readjustment. However, the stress applied in torture, including psychological torture, is designed to elicit high levels of arousal without the appropriate action that allows arousal to readjust. While these concepts of homeostasis and readjustment are abstract in concept, their application is quite concrete. Because torture techniques deny different needs of victims. Remember, we talked about the need of social interaction. They disrupt homeostasis in different ways. Dr. Uwe Jacobs, a neuropsychologist and expert on the health effects of torture, lays out two examples. First, humans require constantly changing stimuli. When individuals are placed in highly artificial environments that deny them any stimuli through a technique called sensory deprivation, the individual's entire arousal system becomes disorganized. Second, on the other side of this spectrum, torturers target the complementary human need for moderation of stimuli by placing victims in environments that overwhelm the senses. Let's talk about repeated messaging from the media, from your radio, from the news, from the commercials, from everything you see, from the advertisement billboards of the dangers of COVID-19 and social distancing, hand washing, and mask wearing, and oh, do this and do this. And you are overwhelmed. Under ordinary circumstances, when stimuli become too strong for the human brain, that fear stimulus, to accommodate, an individual will use defense maneuvers to reduce the stress. Humans will naturally seek to evade the stimuli. They will habituate to it, and they will distract themselves from it, usually in that order. All of this fear mongering, people will seek to evade it, and then they will habituate to it. It becomes their normal, and then they'll distract themselves from it. So they are habituated to it, and they are no longer going to think about it because it's too much for them. To fill that void, a person will invent stimuli. Within only a few hours of sensory deprivation, victims experience hallucinations and other psychotic symptoms. And here we're talking about the social distancing and the mask wearing and the isolation at home and the quarantining. And this taking away that that sensory part of your existence can actually be highly detrimental to people's psychological well-being to the point that they might have a psychotic break. So Article 6 states that upon being satisfied after an examination of information available to it, that the circumstances so warrant, any state party in whose territory a person alleged to have committed any offense referred to in Article 4 is present shall take him into custody or take other legal measures to ensure his presence. So if there is an act of torture or cruel, degrading, inhumane treatment, any state party, their agency of enforcement should take that person who is alleged into custody or take other legal measures to ensure his presence. And such state shall immediately make a preliminary inquiry into the facts. The state which makes the preliminary inquiry shall promptly report its findings to the said states and shall indicate whether it intends to exercise jurisdiction. The state has a duty to immediately make a preliminary inquiry into the facts of a charge of torture or cruel, degrading, or inhumane treatment and to take the alleged into custody or other legal measure to ensure his or her presence. There is good evidence that demonstrates torture is being committed, as well as cruel, degrading, and inhumane treatment. The state cannot just simply diminish the charge of torture. It is required to investigate into the facts, required to investigate. And they should be an impartial investigative committee. This is part of its duty to safeguard the fundamental rights and freedoms of all humans. This is part of our human rights to have recourse for any violations of our human rights. Should the state refuse to investigate, the individuals within the state have the right to create other effective remedies, methods of recourse, including, as stated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. And this covenant is in accordance with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, means that it is subject to that declaration. Article 10 states that each state party shall ensure that education and information regarding the prohibition against torture are fully included in the training of law enforcement personnel, civil or military, medical personnel, public officials, and other persons who may be involved in the custody, interrogation, or treatment of any individual subjected to any form of arrest, detention, or imprisonment. The lockdowns or virtual imprisonment of citizens within their borders, within their counties, within their homes, with restrictions of liberties, removal of the ability to support oneself and one's family, removal of personal autonomy. To employ fear mongering and coercive tactics to force compliance is an act of torture, and it is cruel, it is degrading, and it is inhumane. Any individuals involved in these practices can effectively be charged with this offense, which is of torture, which is criminal in the Canadian Criminal Code and in international law. And we're going to look at the Rome Statute for crimes against humanity. Each state party shall include this prohibition in the rules or instructions issued in regard to the duties and functions of any such person. Article 12 states that each party shall ensure that its competent authorities proceed to a prompt and impartial investigation wherever there is reasonable ground to believe that an act of torture has been committed in any territory under its jurisdiction. The police, by refusing to investigate, are in violation of this covenant and therefore complicit in the crime. Article 13, each state party shall ensure that any individual who alleges he has been subjected to torture in any territory under its jurisdiction has the right to complain to and to have his case promptly and impartially examined by its competent authorities. Steps shall be taken to ensure that the complainant and witnesses are protected against all ill treatment or intimidation as a consequence of his complaint or any evidence given. Now, did the police who were presented with evidence for the reckless endangerment and criminal negligence for children in Ontario, in parts of Ontario, did the police have the cases promptly and impartially examined by competent authorities and impartial authorities? What were the reasons stated for not following up with an arrest? Why do the police state that the claims are baseless and not sufficient? This must be the case if the police claim that calling the police to come and arrest the mayor at a citizen's arrest is a crime. They are stating then that there is no crime being committed by the mayor. What is the reasoning behind this statement? What exactly have they said and what evidence is provided by the police? The police claim that the citizens performing the arrest lawfully and peacefully by calling the police to perform the arrest were committing a crime because they were wasting police time. This is gaslighting. The police, the enforcement agency, is attempting to criminalize the citizens who complained, which is another violation because they should be protected. They should have their case promptly and impartially examined by competent authorities. They should have steps taken to ensure that the complainant and witnesses are protected against all ill treatment or intimidation as a consequence of their complaint or any evidence given. Article 14 states that each state party shall ensure in its legal system that the victim of an act of torture obtains redress and has an enforceable right to fair and adequate compensation, including the means for a full rehabilitation as possible. In the event of the death of the victim as a result of an act of torture, his dependents shall be entitled to compensation. Article 16 states that each party shall undertake to prevent in any territory under its jurisdiction other acts of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment which do not amount to torture as defined in Article 1. Again, when such acts are committed by or at the instigation of or with the consent or acquiescence of a public official or other person acting in an official capacity. Now, we've already covered the definition of cruel, but let's look at inhuman and degrading. Inhuman is stated as not suited for human needs. Again, humans need social interaction. Humans need oxygen to breathe. Humans do not need to breathe in particulates from a mass. They do not need to breathe in excess CO2. Humans need to be able to move about freely. Humans need their human rights that are inherent, inalienable. Inhuman is lacking kindness, pity, or compassion. Inhuman means to be without conscience or human feeling or empathy. Social distancing, masking, use of antibacterial soaps, exposure to constant fear mongering, isolating, and quarantining are all inhuman as they interfere with the homeostasis of the human being psychologically and affect him or her physiologically. Denying visitors to elderly in care homes, denying visitors to patients who are sick and dying in hospital, denying available medical care, denying access to alternatives as per the conscience of the human being, denying any fundamental, inalienable human rights and freedoms is inhuman. Degrading means dishonoring or disrespecting greatly, means debasing, disgraceful, lowering, or wearing down. The COVID measures, especially the fear mongering and coercive tactics, are designed to wear down the individual into compliance. This is 100% degrading, as it is forcing another who is born free to be controlled by the obligation or will of another, to become a slave, to become subject to the obligation or will of another. So, finally, as we end here, we're going to look at the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And we're going to look specifically at Article 7 with the crimes against humanity and go through some of the definitions of these. And then we're also going to look at Article 6, which is more severe, but something to keep in mind. Crimes against humanity. For the purpose of this statute, crime against humanity means any of the following acts when committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack: murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation or forcible transfer of population, imprisonment, or other severe deprivation of physical liberty in violation of fundamental rules of international law, torture. It will have rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization, and so on. Persecution against any identifiable group or collectivity on political, racial, national, ethnic, cultural, religious, gender, as defined in paragraph 3, or other grounds that are universally recognized as impermissible under international law in connection with any act referred to in this paragraph or any crime within the jurisdiction of this court. Enforced disappearance of persons, the crime of apartheid, and other inhumane acts of a similar character intentionally causing great suffering or serious injury to body or to mental or physical health. Definitions of terms: attack directed against a civilian population means a course of conduct involving the multiple commission of acts referred to in paragraph 1 against any civilian population pursuant to or in furtherance of a state or organizational policy to commit such an attack. Extermination. Now, we know that this is something that is being kept an eye on, especially with the elderly population. This includes the intentional infliction of conditions of life, inter alia, the deprivation of access to food and medicine, calculated to bring about the destruction of part of a population. Enslavement. Again, this is being made subject to the obligation or will of another. Means the exercise of any or all of the powers attaching to the right of ownership over a person. Deportation or forcible transfer of a population means forced displacement of the persons concerned by expulsion or other coercive acts from the area in which they are lawfully present without grounds permitted under international law. Now, we've already set the precedent for this, which is why it's so important to look at, because we've extended police powers, allowing for the deportation of individuals without judicial oversight. And this is because of COVID-19. Torture means the intentional infliction of severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, upon a person in the custody or under the control of the accused, except that torture shall not, and so on from the lawful sanctions. We went over that already. Persecution means the intentional and severe deprivation of fundamental rights contrary to international law by reason of the identity of the group or collectivity. We're having persecution of anybody who is not going along with the official COVID-19 narrative. And it is severe, and it is going to get worse unless we individually stand up for our rights, recognize our humanity, and put an end to it. The crime of apartheid means inhumane acts of a character similar to those referred to in paragraph 1, committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, committed with the intent of maintaining that regime. Now, for the purposes we're looking into here, we have a group of people who believe in a transhumanist agenda. Now, I know that term may turn some people off, but it is a factual term. The transhumanist movement is combining man with machine. And this is with the use of nanoparticles that exist as genetic engineering technology that are in the mRNA vaccines. So what they're going to have is something like the film, which I believe was also a book called Gattaca. And you're going to have a group of people who are a separate race, who are transhuman, that will be separated from the rest, if that is even a possibility. But right now, with the persecution, we're having the creation of a potential creation, well, the start of a segregated society of people who are following the medical martial law and people who are standing up against it. And, there are very good reasons for that. But we're creating that state of apartheid. Enforced disappearance of persons is included here. This means the arrest, detention, or abduction of persons by or with the authorization, support, or acquiescence of a state or political organization, followed by a refusal to acknowledge that deprivation of freedom or to give information on the fate or whereabouts of those persons, with the intention of removing them from the protection of the law for a prolonged period of time. And this can go for the quarantine, where they have stated, such as in Quebec, that they will not disclose where the quarantine locations are, and that they can remove people without judicial oversight and put them in a location of their choosing. So this is something to be very concerned about. All crimes against humanity are something everybody should be concerned about, because this is not where we want to go. Article 6. Genocide. We're looking at killing members of a group as the elderly, a target, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, again with the psychological torture, the enforced mask wearing, which is detrimental both psychologically and physically, the vaccine mandates for vaccines that are not proven safe and effective, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and then forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, I don't think anybody wants to get to this state, but we have to look very carefully at what is happening here, because when you give up your individual sovereignty, where do you draw the line and say enough is enough? Where do you stand your ground and say, I am not going in that direction? I am not going to be a part of inflicting this kind of treatment on another human being with inherent dignity and equal, inalienable rights. A human being who is born free, like I am. And I am making that choice now to stand in my freedom. COVID-19 has been stated in terms of war with frontline workers and all that same terminology. And it's being treated as such, as an enemy to destroy, to stop the spread, and so on. Often we've heard from the people who would shame others for not staying in their homes at the beginning. You had your relatives who gave their lives in World War II and World War I, and all you have to do is stay home. That's all that's being asked of you. So war crimes mean willful killing, torture or inhumane treatment, including biological experiments, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health, and extensive destruction and appropriation of property not justified by military necessity and carried out unlawfully and wantonly. Persons liable. In accordance with this statute, a person shall be criminally responsible and liable for punishment for a crime within the jurisdiction of the court if that person A, commits such a crime, whether as an individual, jointly with another, or through another person, regardless of whether that other person is criminally responsible. B, orders, solicits, or induces the commission of such a crime, which in fact occurs or is attempted. C, for the purpose of facilitating the commission of such a crime, aids, abets, or otherwise assists in its commission or its attempted commission, including providing the means for its commission. D, in any other way contributes to the commission or attempted commission of such a crime by a group of persons acting with a common purpose. Such contribution shall be intentional and shall either I, be made with the aim of furthering the criminal activity or criminal purpose of the group, where such activity or purpose involves the commissions of a crime within the jurisdiction of the court, or 2, be made in the knowledge of the intention of the group to commit the crime, in respect of the crime of genocide, directly and publicly incites others to commit genocide. Attempts to commit such a crime by taking action that commences its execution by means of a substantial step, but the crime does not occur because of circumstances independent of the person's intentions. So that there is the end of part 3 in our series on human rights. And I want to thank you for watching. And again, I want to reiterate that this is a starting point. And you can go on to my website, goodfoodonearth.com, and find the links to these documents. And I would suggest that you look at them yourself, read them, do your own investigations, your own research, know your human rights, know how to stand up for them. And then you can be prepared for whatever comes your way. And hopefully, you can raise awareness and educate others.